This episode of Eritrawi podcast explores the Livraghi scandal of 1891, which is historically known as the Facts of Masua.
Right.
And it really matters because this was the exact moment. The whole illusion of a, civilized European occupation in Africa just completely collapsed in the public eye.
Yeah, it completely laid bare a horrific massacre in colonial Eritrea.
Exactly. It sparked these serious high-level debates in Italy about just abandoning their African territories altogether. So stick with us, because today's deep dive involves a mafia-style shakedown operated from within a police force, a rigged military tribunal, an international manhunt, and a whistleblower who forced a whole nation to look in the mirror.
It is a staggering sequence of events, honestly.
Yeah.
And just to set expectations for you listening, we need to note right up front that this is episode 1 of 2.
Yeah, the sheer volume of this is huge.
It really is. The historical maneuvering, the court cases, the political fallout, it's just way too massive for a single sitting.
Definitely. And as a quick disclaimer before we begin, our goal today is to impartially report the historical facts and the viewpoints that are contained directly in the historical records we're analyzing.
Right. We aren't taking political sides here.
Not at all. We are simply tracing the ideas, the documented actions, and the history exactly as they unfolded. So today, we're looking specifically at how systemic paranoia and, colonial racism allowed two men to orchestrate the deaths of nearly 1,000 people.
And how the Italian press finally caught up with them to really grasp how two colonial officers managed to execute nearly 1,000 people without, immediate interference from Rome. We have to look at the structural insecurities of the Italian colony.
Like in Assab and Massawa during the late 1880s, right?
Exactly. The early occupation was incredibly precarious. Rome couldn't afford to ship tens of thousands of Italian soldiers to the Horn of Africa.
Right, the cost would be insane.
Yeah, and they couldn't maintain the logistical supply lines for an army that size either. So the colonial administration heavily relied on indigenous mercenaries and local armed bands to police the territory.
Okay, let's unpack this, because relying on local mercenaries makes sense from a purely financial perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But it fundamentally means the occupying power doesn't actually have a monopoly on force. Like, the people holding the rifles are the people whose land you are actively occupying.
That is the crucial vulnerability. And that vulnerability was completely exposed in 1887 at the Battle of Dogali.
Wow.
Yeah, an Italian column was decisively wiped out by Ethiopian forces. And that happens again in 1888 at Saganati, where 5 Italian officers were killed in a reprisal.
So these weren't just minor skirmishes.
No, they were catastrophic military failures that sent absolute shockwaves all the way back to Europe.
But wait, instead of the military command saying, hey, we miscalculated our strategy, or we underestimated the local resistance, they just completely deflected.
Totally deflected.
General Soletta, who was the commander of the colonial troops, he decides the problem isn't their tactics. He decides the problem is an enemy within. He actually blames the very indigenous troops keeping their colony afloat,
accusing them of mass treason.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, colonial administrations often function on a really fragile myth of inherent supremacy.
Right.
Admitting that an indigenous force outmaneuvered you strategically, that is psychologically unacceptable to a 19th century European command structure.
They just couldn't handle it.
No, they couldn't. So they construct a different narrative. They say, we didn't lose because we were outsmarted. We lost because we were betrayed.
Wow. And so General Soletta institutes a special commission to actively hunt for informants and, evaluate imprisoned Eritreans.
Right.
I really want to focus on the mechanism of this commission.
Right.
Because they aren't just doing routine background checks here.
Oh, definitely not.
They are given sweeping, completely unchecked powers to detain, interrogate, and eliminate suspected threats under this incredibly vague umbrella of internal security. It's essentially a blank check for state violence.
And that blank check is handed to 2 very specific individuals. First, we have Eteocle Cagnassi, a lawyer who serves as the Secretary for Indigenous Affairs.
So he controls all the bureaucracy.
Exactly. And second, we have Dario Livraghi, a lieutenant and the head of the indigenous police, the Carabinieri.
The physical muscle.
You got it. He controls the physical force. Bureaucratic cover meets physical muscle.
According to the historical texts, for a year and a half, these 2 men ran an arbitrary repression that resulted in just under 1,000 victims.
It's horrifying.
It is. But what I don't understand is the logistics of it. How do you physically disappear nearly 1,000 people in a coastal colony without Rome stepping in and asking questions?
You do it by manipulating the chaos of a frontier administration.
Yeah.
When you control both the indigenous police and the paperwork for indigenous affairs, you literally control the entire narrative.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so a prisoner is executed in a ravine, and Cagnassi simply files a report stating they died of typhoid.
Or that they were transferred somewhere.
Exactly, transferred to a remote labor camp, or that they attempted an escape. Because the commission was operating under martial law to root out quote-unquote spies, normal judicial oversight was just entirely suspended.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because they didn't just use this system to eliminate perceived political threats.
Yeah, they did.
They monetized it.
Yeah.
The historical texts show they turned this internal security apparatus into basically a state-sponsored protection racket.
It functioned exactly like organized crime, but with the full weight of a colonial government backing it up.
Unbelievable.
Masua was this wealthy, bustling port city on the Red Sea. It was a massive hub for international trade. And Cagnassi and Livraghi looked at the wealthy Arab and local notables in the city and realized they had the perfect leverage.
Pay us, or we'll declare you a traitor to the Italian crown.
Precisely. They operated massive thefts and extortions. They would identify a wealthy merchant, threaten to haul them before the special commission on fabricated charges of, conspiring with Ethiopian forces.
Right.
And then demand exorbitant bribes to make the whole investigation just go away.
And if they paid?
If the merchant paid, they lived. If they didn't, or if they became a liability somehow, they were liquidated and their assets were often seized.
But extortion rings usually collapse when the greed outpaces the caution.
Right.
Like if you're skimming off the top, you go after the middle-tier targets who don't have the political connections to fight back.
Right.
But in February 1890, they make a massive miscalculation.
A huge one.
They arrest Musa El Akkad and Hamad Kantibai Hassan.
This is the turning point right here. Musa El Akkad was not a middle-tier target. He was a wildly rich Arab Muslim merchant who had relocated from British Egypt.
He was a major player.
A major power broker. He had a long history of collaborating with the Italians to secure lucrative trade routes. And Hamad Kantibai Hassan was equally prominent. He was the chief of the Habab tribe, which was a group that had pledged absolute loyalty to the colonial administration.
So these are literally two of the most powerful, loyal allies the Italians have in the region.
Exactly.
So what exactly is the mechanism of taking them down? Like, how do you legally justify arresting your own best assets?
Livraghi and Cagnassi accuse Akkad and Kantibai of conspiring with Abyssinian warlords.
It guarantees a visceral, terrified response in the military command. But what is the actual evidence they present?
A single, highly convenient letter allegedly found on Akkad's servant.
Unbelievable.
Supposedly detailing military secrets meant for the Ethiopians.
I'm genuinely confused here by the legal process, though. They convene a special military tribunal. But Cagnassi and Livraghi, the very men who supposedly uncovered this plot and organized the arrests, they also act as the primary witnesses during the trial.
Yes, they do.
How does a military tribunal accept such an egregious conflict of interest?
Well, because it wasn't a civilian court of law. It was a military tribunal operating under that paranoid post-Degali martial law that General Saletta had instituted.
Ah, right. So they didn't care about due process.
Not at all. The tribunal wasn't looking for reasonable doubt. They were looking for expediency. The environment was so steeped in racial prejudice and colonial anxiety that the word of an Italian lieutenant and a bureaucratic secretary was just taken as absolute gospel against indigenous defendants.
Regardless of the glaring inconsistencies in the physical evidence.
Exactly.
Can you imagine the audacity here? They are framing their wealthiest, most loyal allies just to seize their assets, and they ram this trial through in less than a week.
Less than a week.
Between February 5th and February 11th, 1890, the tribunal condemns both Akkad and Kantibai to death. It's a complete railroading. They are moments away from legally executing them.
But they overlooked one critical geographic detail. Musa El Akkad's wealth and influence didn't just exist in Masua.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he was an international merchant who had previously traveled to Rome to negotiate trade monopolies.
Oh, wow.
And during that trip, he had personally met and established a relationship with the Italian Prime Minister, Francesco Crispi.
That is an incredible detail. So when the telegraph reaches Rome that Musa El Akkad has been sentenced to death for treason, the Prime Minister sees the name and immediately flags it.
Crispi's intervention functions somewhat like a sudden hostile corporate audit on a branch office that has been cooking the books for years.
Right.
Crispy knows Cagnassi's somewhat shady reputation. He knows Akkad personally, and the timeline simply doesn't add up for him. So on February 11th, Crispy intervenes directly, ordering that the death sentences be commuted to life imprisonment.
And while spending over a year in a colonial prison is still a horrific injustice, that intervention saves their lives.
It does.
But more importantly, from a systemic level, it completely breaks the illusion of Livraghi and Cagnassi's invincibility. For a year and a half, they operated under the assumption that Rome was too far away to care.
And suddenly the Home Office is asking to see the receipts.
Exactly.
And this intense pressure from Rome forces the local commander, General Baldissera, to act. He can no longer turn a blind eye to what's happening. In March 1890, he forces Cagnassi to resign.
But Rome goes further than that, right?
Yeah. They dispatch Vincenzo Piccolo-Cupani, who is the internal affairs counselor, to conduct a ground-up investigation of the trial.
And Piccolo-Cupani actually does the work. He doesn't just ask Cagnassi for his version of events. He pulls the physical records, he cross-references the timelines, he interviews the local guard.
He really digs in.
And by October of 1890, he mathematically proves that the letter was forged and the February trial was a complete sham. He formally requests that Cagnassi and Livraghi face a real tribunal for slander, abuse of office, and extortion.
But naturally, neither man intends to stand trial in the colony they just terrorized. They realize their political cover has evaporated, so they flee.
This triggers an international manhunt, which, in 1890s Europe is incredibly difficult.
Plus impossible.
There is no digital surveillance, no wiretaps. If you get on a civilian steamship and cross a border, you are essentially a ghost. But Cagnassi makes a mistake. He heads to Rome and is tracked down and arrested in October.
Right.
But Livraghi manages to slip through the Italian port, makes it to Milan, and then quickly crosses the border into Switzerland, settling down in Lugano.
The colonial administration likely breathed a sigh of relief at this point.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. One man is quietly detained, the other is completely out of their jurisdiction. The bureaucratic hope was that the scandal would just fade into obscurity.
But once the architects of this terror fled, the people left behind in Massawa, like the local guards, the extortion victims, the families of the dead, they finally felt safe enough to talk.
And the Italian press was listening.
This brings us to March 4th, 1891. The newspaper La Tribuna publishes an explosive front-page investigation by their special envoy, Napoleone Corazzini, titled The Deeds of the Indigenous Police in Africa.
Corazzini completely dismantles the colonial administration's narrative. He documents that Livraghi wasn't just fighting quote-unquote rebels. He had weaponized the indigenous police to control the local hashish trade.
Wow, so he was running drugs too.
Yeah. Because Massawa was a massive port city, it was a natural funnel for contraband. Livraghi simply used his carabinieri to eliminate rival smugglers and monopolize the drug profits.
That is wild.
He exposes the financial extortion of the merchants. He details the use of torture in the local prisons.
And crucially, Corazzini didn't just deal in vague statistics about corruption. He provided the Italian public with the horrifying, specific faces of the victims. He detailed the mechanics of the sadistic murder.
History here is incredibly grim.
It is. The text details the murder of a man named Getethon. He was dragged into a mountain gorge by the indigenous police and shot twice by Livraghi himself. But Getethon actually survived the gunshots.
Yeah.
He stood back up, bleeding, and begged for his life. And instead of showing any mercy, Livraghi just sat atop his horse and ordered his men to beat Getethon to death with stones and heavy sticks.
Brutal.
And then they threw his body into a grave they had dug before they even left the city.
And then there is the case of Naib Osman, who was a revered, elderly Muslim holy man. He was arrested, marched a few kilometers outside the city limits, and brought to the edge of his own pre-dug grave.
This one is just, it's hard to hear.
The historical record notes a moment of deep resistance here, actually. Livraghi ordered his Muslim guards to execute the holy man, and they actively refused.
So Livraghi does it himself. He shoots the old man twice. And the detail that the historical text emphasizes, the image that was broadcast to the entire Italian public, is that Livraghi was laughing convulsively as he pulled the trigger.
Yeah.
And then he just stood there casually smoking a cigarette, watching his men bury the body.
It forces the public to confront the absolute banality of the violence being carried out in their name.
So what does this all mean for the public reading this in 1891? We really have to remember the context of the Italian colonial project.
Right, the propaganda.
The government had sold this African expansion to the public as this grand civilizing mission. They were supposed to be bringing law, order, and modernity to the Horn of Africa.
Right.
And over their morning coffee, Italian citizens are reading documented proof that their civilizing officers are operating drug cartels and laughing while executing religious leaders in ditches.
The reaction was a seismic political shockwave. While the Italian press wasn't as massively industrialized as, the British or French press of the era, this story tapped directly into the deep anxieties of a newly unified Italy.
It just struck a nerve.
It spread virally. Every regional and national paper syndicated the details. The public outrage was immediate and deafening. In Parliament, Deputy Colonial immediately demanded that the Minister of Foreign Affairs answer for these crimes.
At this point, the public thinks this is a story about a dozen or so horrific murders committed by a sadistic rogue police chief.
Just a few bad apples.
Right. It's a massive scandal, but it's contained to the actions of a few individuals. But literally the very next day, the true scale of the violence drops.
Yeah.
And the source of the leak is the absolute last person you'd expect.
On March 5th, a rival newspaper in Milan, Il Secolo, prints a headline that changes absolutely everything. The murderers in Africa, 800 dead.
800.
Yeah. They had acquired a document, a memorial it was called, written by Dario Livraghi himself from his hideout in Switzerland.
Wait, why would a man hiding from the law voluntarily write to the press and admit to 800 murders? That makes no sense.
Because Livraghi saw the writing on the wall. He read Corazzini's article the day before and realized the government was preparing to pin the entire colonial disaster entirely on him and Cagnassi as rogue actors.
Oh, I see.
So the memorial was his desperate defense strategy. He admits to the executions. He confirms the death toll is not a dozen, but 800 people. But he completely rejects the premise that he was acting alone.
His defense is the chilling, historically infamous claim, I was just following orders.
Exactly. He explicitly names the highest authorities in the colony, General Baldissera and General Herrero. Livraghi claims he was merely a subordinate instrument executing the direct, systemic policies mandated by the military high command.
What's fascinating here is how this single piece of paper from Switzerland completely transforms the legal and historical reality of the scandal. If Livraghi is telling the truth, then this wasn't just a case of two corrupt officials slipping through the cracks of a well-meaning administration. If the generals ordered this, or, even just sanctioned the environment that allowed it to happen, then state-sponsored terror wasn't an aberration. It was the fundamental policy of the colonial project.
This raises an important question for historians, and obviously for the Italian public at the time. How do you prosecute an entire system?
Right.
Livraghi's admission elevated this from a true crime story of police corruption into a full-blown national existential crisis. It forced the Italian parliament to ask whether they could legally or morally maintain their African colonies if this was the required cost of control.
Going from a handful of known victims to a staggering 800 dead essentially paralyzed the government. The scandal just dominated the front pages of Italian newspapers for the rest of 1891.
Yeah, the political maneuverings that followed the attempts to silence the press, the legal battles, and the profound debates in Parliament, they are incredibly dense and consequential.
Which is exactly why you need to stay tuned for Episode 2. We will trace the direct fallout of Livraghi's explosive confession, the fate of the generals he accused, and what ultimately happened to the men who blew the whistle on the entire operation.
But before we wrap up today's session, I want to leave you with a thought to ponder. Consider Livraghi's defense from his Swiss hideout that he oversaw the deaths of 800 people simply because the colonial command structure required it.
It forces you to wonder, when a bureaucratic system is built entirely on a foundation of unchecked power, racial supremacy, and institutional paranoia, where exactly does the guilt of the individual officer end and the guilt of the state begin?
It's a dark thought, but a necessary one.
Thank you for listening to Eritrawi Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe and share it with anyone interested in Eritrean history.